for the most part, the primary physiological kind of overarching adaptation that we're looking at is increase in VO2 max. Okay, an increase in aerobic capacity. So what we're going to get at a little bit today is going to be how should we train? Okay, very cursory, very kind of surface level. How should we train? How often? What matters? Those kinds of things. We'll talk about what changes. Okay, what are the actual adaptations? You guys mentioned some, right? About max heart rate, about heart size. Nobody mentioned mitochondria. Nobody mentioned fiber type or any of those things. You guys talked about body weight and body size and body composition, muscle mass. We'll talk about kind of, are there some of those things that are going to play a role? Some do, some don't. And then we'll try to just brush the surface on what's the stimulus. What is the thing that drives the change? I'm going to be really honest with you guys that we still don't fully understand all of it. Okay? Kind of like we do with resistance exercise, I'm going to show you all from a kind of a thing that drives androgen production. There's a couple of genes through which most things are going to signal, something called PGC1 alpha. But for some of the other ones, we understand kind of cardiac hypertrophy and stuff pretty well. But for some of it, we don't fully understand. Okay. But the hope on all of this is if you know what needs to change and you know what your goal is, then you can tailor what you're doing when you train to provide the right stimulus to hopefully evoke the change that we're looking for. Okay. All right. So just like what we did with resistance training, why do you train? Well, the biggest issue for folks for y'all today is you want to increase performance. You want VO2 max to go up. You want lactate threshold to change. You want to be able to run farther or faster or bike farther or bike faster, whatever it is that you're doing, right? I need this to be a better basketball player or a football player or a CrossFit, whatever person thing that they do. But then the other piece of this, and this is why I would try to implore you guys to add some aerobic training to your lives, is VO2 max is arguably the single best predictor of lifespan. Okay? So maintenance of VO2 max across your life, which comes from doing aerobic training, is going to predict mortality. Primarily because when you do lots of aerobic training, it keeps your cardiovascular system healthy. And cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death. Okay, so those are going to be kind of the two primary reasons that people train, and you might need to train differently for those kinds of things. We've talked about fatigue, right? Most of you have a pretty good understanding of what fatigue is based upon your answers on the test. Okay, but if we're thinking about trying to do performance-based kinds of things, right? Addie wants to run 5K in a certain time. What is it that's going to keep her from doing that? It's very likely going to be an accumulation of central and or fluid. Okay, so if performance is limited by fatigue, and the performance of exercise that might improve health is going to be potentially limited by fatigue or motivation or something, then what we need to try to do is train in a way that we invoke adaptations that will limit the primary things that cause fatigue. So our performance goes up. In theory, then maybe we can do more, and then our health. So, again, some of you did well with this on your test, some a little bit less well, but what's the primary cause of fatigue? Well, hydrogen ions from lactic acid, okay? Peripheral fatigue. And then central fatigue-wise, we're thinking about substrate depletion, so depletion of glycogen, blood glucose, creatine phosphate, depletion of fat stores, very rare, but I guess it could happen, or our ability to deliver glucose and fat. So mobilization of these two. Getting glucose out of glycogen storage sites, getting fat out of its storage sites. So we need to try to do things that will limit this from happening. Okay? So what we're going to do when we train is we're going to try to hopefully evoke some adaptations and some changes. And there may be changes in the muscle itself. Okay. There may be changes in the metabolic system contained in the muscle. So we'll kind of merge these two things together. Okay. There will be changes in the cardiovascular system, and potentially there could be changes in the pulmonary or respiratory system. They're really okay. Especially if you've got normal pulmonary function. There's really not a lot that we can do there. We can train the diaphragm some. We can do some level of breathe training and those kinds of things. I did see some interesting data last week at my conference on doing essentially sort of like forced breathing exercise in young stroke survivors. And it did actually seem to have some effects, but they're super sedentary, and it was helping them with some kind of overcome some other stuff as well. So you can evoke changes there, but they're likely not going to be a lot. Okay. This is going to look a lot like what we saw with resistance training. It's just going to be different things that cause it. Okay? If you want to evoke changes, we must evoke overload. Okay? We must evoke overload. So, play. We want to overload your aerobic metabolic system or your cardiovascular system. What do I need to do? Run more than I can. Okay? Is that even possible? I mean, if I can't do it, can I run more than whatever? I mean, I know you don't. Normal or something, right? Do more than you normally do. Make your cardiovascular system work harder than it normally does. Make your aerobic metabolic systems work harder than they normally do. Okay? So we need to find a way to overload these systems because that disrupts homeostasis and that drives the adaptation, just like with resistance. We also have to remember that there's going to be specificity in these adaptations. If you tax the cardiovascular system, the adaptations will occur in the cardiovascular system. If you tax the metabolic systems, right, in a certain way, that's where they're going to happen. If you run, you're going to get slightly different adaptations than if you row or if you bike. Okay? So, how do we overload? Well, we got to increase work. Okay? Work is basically intensity, duration, and frequency. How much do you do, at what intensity do you do it, and how often, right? So I work out 3 days per week for 30 minutes at an intensity of, let's just say, 60% of VO2 max, right? That's how much work I normally do. I want to overload myself. I need to go harder at the same duration and frequency, or I need to go same intensity but go longer for the same frequency, or some combination of all of these things. Okay? If we increase work, we tend to increase fatigue. Increasing fatigue is one of the things that seems to drive adaptations. Okay? That drives the adaptations because fatigue is bad. And so the system will adapt to limit fatigue. Okay, I'm going to show you guys this, and then we can talk about it a little bit more. Because I think it's a really interesting. What I'm going to tell you, this only applies for training to increase VO2 max. Only for VO2 max. Okay? Please note, I'm saying only for VO2 max. This is very important. Okay? To make your VO2 max go up, exercise intensity is the single most important thing that drives training adaptation. So if you're used to walking, jog. If you're used to jogging, jog faster. If you're used to jogging fast, go even faster. Okay? Intensity, especially for folks that are y'all's age and of your relative sort of kind of health status, we need to work out probably somewhere north of 50% of VO2 max in order to evoke. Okay? I may be less fit enough that going under 50% of VO2 max might work for me. For your grandparents, probably true. To be honest, for most of y'all in this room, you probably need to be at 60% or greater of your VO2 max. Okay? Now you're young, you're generally relatively healthy and active, and you're going to need push. So that means go faster. go up a hill, okay? Or increase the resistance, whatever it is that you're doing, okay? Turn up the resistance on the elliptical or the spin bike or whatever else it is. All of the things that we can change, this is the thing. This is also probably the thing that people do the least of. Why? Why do people not want intensity to be high? It hurts. It's terrible, right? It's terrible. I think I say this in Principles of Health and Fitness, but if you exercise, train, and you enjoy it, work harder. Okay? I don't understand the people that are like, oh, exercise, it was so much fun. I'm like, what were you doing? Right? And I get, right, that there are people that's their thing. But for me, I don't ever really enjoy it. I do it because I have to. Or in some ways, because it's supposedly good for me. All right? So this is the most important thing. Right? That's the most important thing. Promise you there'll be a question about that. Okay? Now, with duration and frequency, we're not going to make any sort of value judgment on which one of these would be second and which would be third. But I just want you to know that for increasing VO2 max at a constant intensity and a constant frequency, we can increase your sort of exercise duration and get increases in VO2 max up to about 40 minutes of exercise. Okay? Once you get over 40, an hour doesn't get you more of an increase than doing 40 minutes. Okay? Similarly with frequency, about 4 to 5 days. Anything a 6th and a 7th day doesn't necessarily get us an increase in VO2 over doing 4 work. Okay? And how many days a week do you run?
4 to 5.
Used to be 6, okay? They gave y'all 1 day off, okay? Okay. How long do you go?
Depends on the day, but like 45 minutes to an hour usually.
45 to an hour, okay? So at that pace, I mean, you're covering 5, 6, 7 miles, okay? Want to tell everybody what you race at? Like, what's your event?
400 meters.
Runs 400 meters in a half mile. And yet when you train, you run 6 or 7 miles or all of this stuff during the week. And it used to be more. Fascinating. So, you run too much? No. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Right? There's a lot of debate on a lot of those kinds of things. Okay? So, what I didn't say on all of this, please hear this. What I didn't say was you should never run more than 40 minutes. You should never run more than 5 days per week. Okay? It's just that the pure VO2 adaptation is not going to be enhanced by doing more than. Okay? Anybody run a marathon? Anybody ever try to run a marathon? No, that where we go. Okay? Right. Amateur marathoners, 4, 4.5, 5 hours, 6 hours. I promise you, if you've never run a marathon, all you ever did was run for 40 minutes because that got you to where your VO2 was, you are not going to have a pleasant day. You may not have a pleasant day, period, ever, if you run a marathon. But there are some other kinds of adaptations from a central fatigue standpoint, and kind of understanding what it's going to feel like and how it will work and how that makes your joints adapt and things. This is just for VO2. Okay? This is just for VO2. So that's why kind of how I think that we should train. All of you should go 3 or 4 times per week and just go, run a couple of miles as fast as you can. That's legitimately a good thing for your health. He's laughing at me. Why are you laughing? It's like, nope, I'm out. Okay? Right? Starting next week, if you guys are all still around, we'll just meet over across the way. And we'll just, every Monday and Wednesday at 1. And we'll just, as a group, we'll just go run as fast as we can. Right? I know Danny runs faster than me because the last time I was over there doing things, Danny was kicking my ass, running around with his buddies. So I applaud him for all of that. But, right, this is not about ego. It's It's not about ego, it's not about how fast you are, it's about what is it relative to you. So go as fast as you can. Then I think that's a reasonable kind of thing. That would improve health. And as you guys will see, generally, your trainability from a VO2 max standpoint is likely much greater or much more consistent in more people than your ability to train. I can make almost every one of you in here with some very basic sort of training things that follow this significantly better. Kelly, you doubt me? Okay. It's just, this is one of those, if you just do it, then we're going to get we are designed evolutionarily to be endurance athletes in many, many ways. We are great at storing excess carbohydrate and fat and having large energy stores. We are really good at thermoregulation. We are designed to be hunter-gatherer endurance type athletes. And that's why we're all obese and have cardiovascular disease, because we don't do that anymore. And our genes are that way. All right. So if you've had health and fitness or anything else is going to look really familiar, these are basically the ACSM guidelines, right? How should you train? 50 to 100% of VO2 max, 20 to 45 minutes, 3 to 5 days per week. It needs to be rhythmic, large muscle movements, walking, running, biking, rowing, elliptical, something like that. Okay? Continuous exercise or interval exercise will both work. 10 minutes at a certain thing now, 10 minutes an hour from now, 10 minutes tonight, and you seem to get roughly the same adaptations if you did it all 30 minutes of the same thing at once. We've tried that to encourage people to exercise more often. Get up in the morning and have an exercise snack of 10 minutes, and then at lunch have another 10 minutes, and then at night have 10. We can all find 10 minutes 3 times a day, right? No, of course we can't, because it sucks. We don't want to do that. But total work is the key. Okay, and then as you become more fit, you got to go harder or longer or another day a week. But the idea really simply is you need to do more than what you're used to doing. Tax your aerobic metabolic systems, and that will likely tax your cardiovascular system. Okay. Respiratory wise, you've got some reserve, you're probably going to be okay. Those are going to be the two big things. Kirby.
Okay, so could you say we should go run our hardest for?
That's not exactly what I said, but okay.
But I probably, what is your, can I walk? Like,
Can you walk a mile? Okay. Then walk fast.
right, but you were saying that you're saying, where in the line, that walking and walk.
So my general guess for most of you guys, right, is that based upon we probably need to be at 50 to 60% of the inch. Walking on flat ground at whatever pace you feel comfortable at is likely not going to be enough to tax your metabolic and cardiovascular system, right? If you go walk, I mean, your heart rate's probably going to be what? 115 beats per minute, 120. Yeah. And so your resting heart rate, hold on, we can figure this out. Your resting heart rate's 51. We'll just call your max 200. You guys remember heart rate reserve? Health and fitness? Or you need to remember it. 200 minus 51. So you need to be at about 126 beats per minute, Kirby, to be at 50% of your heart rate reserve, which is about 50%. So you need to be there before I can feel somewhat confident that we may have those vascular and metabolic adaptations. And that's why I say walking might get there, right? But we're much better off trying to get you to either the
Like, if I were to just take my sparkling medicine, but if I can only make it half a mile, but I could walk for like 2 minutes and then keep like.
So no, there are all sorts of. What I would say is do what you can, and then walk some, and then do what you can, and then just progressively build through all of that. There's all sorts of running programs where it's like run for a minute, walk for a minute, run for a minute, walk for a minute. Do that for a couple of weeks, and it's like run for 90 seconds and walk for a minute. You just kind of progressively increase what you're doing. I think all of that is great. In that way, do what you're able to, and then if you can do that today, then make it a little bit more difficult next year. Do that consistently. That's what I'm. It's not like you got to all go and run like 3 miles, right? But if all you can do is a minute, right? If jogging is hard for me, sometimes it's hard for me, and jogging for like 5 minutes, like those kinds of things, and like then just do that, and then rest, and then do a little bit more because you're getting overload. Okay.
I know it like depends what you want, but most people like I lift like 5 days a week and I do cardio like 3 times a week. Should that be like flipped for like overall like health benefits? Not saying like I want like to be building all this muscle, but like for overall.
I think you're right that it depends upon what your goal is.
Yeah.
Right. I would argue from a health perspective, you're probably better off if you flipped those two.
Okay.
If you did cardio 5 days a week, right, and you did strength training 3 days a week. But it all sorts of depends because what's going to happen is then you're training more, assuming you're doing it all kind of the same. Then you're probably getting, we haven't even talked about, and we'll not in this class talk about, there's interference potentially between concurrently doing resistance training and aerobic training. And when you do them on the same day and the same bout, it gets quite complicated.
Yeah.
But I would say from a health perspective, that VO2 is a better predictor than muscle mass and strength. So those things are also important. So I would flip it if it was me. But care about the other thing that I would do is I would do the Dr. Phil, like, how's that working out for you? Are you happy with whatever are you getting out of that, whatever you want to on those things? And so all of those things are good. So, Good question. Dan,
Do you recommend doing like aerobic training before or after?
I think whichever, if you're going to do them on the same day, whichever one you care the most about, when you're trying to get the most out of on that particular day, so first, right? You're going to induce some level of fatigue by doing either one of those. Whichever one goes second, you're likely not going to be able to be as intense. You're not going to be able to run as fast or as far or to lift as much weight or something as you could if you hadn't done the other one before. Whichever one is the most important for you, that workout that day, you do that one first. Now we're into interference and my brain hurts. That's we don't have a lot of really good data. There have been some studies, but some studies would say whichever one, you do second, you're not going to get as much aerobic adaptations as if you did only aerobic. If you do aerobic, it's probably just because you won't do as much because you're tired from that. But generally, you can get plenty of both by doing it. So, Matt.
So if you do like aerobic early in the morning, and you lift at night, is that like enough time to
recover?
Yeah.
See, I need to teach the fatigue class. I teach a graduate level class in fatigue, but I don't get to teach very often. We need an undergraduate version. So it depends upon what's causing the fatigue. To be honest. Some peripheral fatigue, like from depletion of creatine phosphate and some things like that. Yes, that stuff will recover within 10 or 15 minutes. To be honest, some like impairments of excitation contraction coupling and some of those things will actually last for a couple of days, depending upon what it is that you've done. If you've done some eccentric stuff, there's a little bit of muscle damage, it may last even longer than that. So, it all depends as well on how long the aerobic bout is going to be and what it's. If you lift early and you deplete muscle glycogen from doing all of that, you're not going to get all of it back by that evening. So if you're gonna try to run for, say, an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half or something, you will have less muscle glycogen than you will feel worse. So there's a lot of my favorite movie is the Big Lebowski. You might seen the Big Lebowski. You know about the dude. No. Oh, people. Okay. It'd be like elementary school. Everybody go home and watch the Big Lebowski. Anyway, he says there's a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have yous on this. So it's complicated. But that's better than like doing them immediately back to back. Okay. Zach.
So in like high school, when we did like conditioning wrestling, our coach would always yell at us like, when you think you can't do anymore, you're only at like 50% of your max.
It sounds like something a high school wrestling coach would say.
Yeah. But like kind of going like off of that, like aerobic training and more of like the psychological fatigue. Like, is there a way to like combat that better? Like, physically, like. I don't know. I'm just thinking of like the biopsychosocial model.
How do I physically combat psychological fatigue?
Well, like it's like the same way we're like working out can improve. Like in my head, I'm thinking like how working out can like help improve like mental health.
Yeah, for
Like,
sure.
how it's all
So
connected. So like, is there a way to like?
yeah, of course. And so, you guys ever done something hard you didn't think you could do? Was it easier to do it than the next time? Because you've already done it, you had some sense that transfer to other things. And we see plenty of that, right? Like when you can teach persistence, you can teach people to be able to push through things. You can train, we think a little bit, although we'd like to do it in a follow-up study. We don't have data on that. We think we can train pain tolerance more so than we can pain sensitivity and things. So by putting you in pain, you just kind of get better and used to it. Some people, not everybody. And those things. And so, yes, we can definitely do those things. So absolutely, we can train those kinds. There can be sort of psychological or central fatigue related benefits to some of these facilities. But a lot of it actually is going to be, that stuff can be driven by all of the physiological adaptations because they make you better at using fat. They let you use less blood glucose, you use less muscle glycogen. You make less lactic acid, so you get less peripheral fatigue, so things hurt less, and there's this kind of, it's all sort of interwoven. Okay. So Monday, next week, 1 o'clock, I'll be out there. I'm not gonna hold my breath. See if anybody comes. I'll be here. You guys wanna come and train. Okay? Okay, so let's get into some actual adaptations. Okay, we're going to talk about things from a metabolic perspective that are likely going to happen in the muscle. So I know in the very first slide, I split things into kind of muscular adaptations and then metabolic adaptations. But for the most part, right, all of the metabolic machinery outside of capillaries and our ability to get oxygen to a muscle, it's all in the muscle. The metabolic adaptations are sometimes grouped with muscular things. Okay. So probably unsurprisingly to you guys, we don't see a lot of change in glycolytic pathways. Okay. The way that we get from glucose to pyruvate doesn't change very much. Aerobic training doesn't do a lot for creatine phosphate. It doesn't do a lot for our stores of ADP, those low stores of ADP that we have, or ATP in our muscle. So there's not a lot that goes on in the glycolytic pathway. Okay. We don't do a whole lot by changing LDH activity. One of the things that we do see a very, very big change in, though, and it actually helps us from an aerobic perspective, is when you train aerobically, you guys remember the hexokinase. That very first enzyme that goes from glucose to glucose 6 traps the blood glucose when it comes in. Okay. Hexokinase levels skyrocket in people that are trained. So you become better at getting glucose when it gets in, trapping it so that we can hopefully then stick it through aerobic metabolism. Okay. But there's not a lot else that happens glycolytically. I'll give you a little bit of what we've seen. Second, most of our adaptations take place, though, in the aerobic side of things. So they're going to take place in the mitochondria. Okay. In the mitochondria. So we'll talk our way through some of those in a minute. Okay. People have looked, and you might think, right, if I have better aerobic metabolism, maybe I can get an adaptation in phosphofructokinase, rate limiting step in glycolysis, so that would make that system work better. Very, very mixed results. Very mixed results. We don't see that it either speeds up or slows down very much. In some studies, you see a little bit of a change in content, so the amount of it may go up, right? As I said, hexokinase goes way up, but then that helps us just keep the glucose track. Not a lot going on here. LDH activity, it's not in many ways like we can change LDH and make it less active. Okay. Remember that your LDH enzyme is going to be somewhat dependent upon fiber type. Okay. Aerobic training, just like and that's going to be in the slides later. Aerobic training, just like resistance training, will turn type 2X fibers into type 2A. It will not turn type 2 fibers into type 1. It does not turn type 1 into type 2. Okay, so in that way, it's really, really not going to cause us much of a shift in LDH. So we're going to see, though, that we're going to really be able to ramp up how much pyruvate can go into the mitochondria. And that's how we're going to limit lactate production rather than altering sort of or slowing down LDH. Okay. Remember my diagram that I drew here, we're really going to ramp up the right side of things rather than changing anything as we did over there. Okay. Now, if there are some adaptations, okay, if there are some adaptations in these things, and this is also going to be true though for pretty much all of our other ones as well. What we're trying to get at, okay, what we're trying to get at is don't eat up our muscle glycogen. Hexokinase goes up so we can get more glucose in from the blood and trap it. Okay. Spare muscle glycogen so that we can hang on to it longer, which will let us go for a longer amount of time without feeling really shitty, and make less lactate. Okay. But primarily the less lactate is not because of its shift in PFK or LDH. It's going to be a shift on the sort of the aerobic, the other side of that equation. Okay. Questions? These two things, right? If I keep my glycogen and I don't make lactate, I'll harken back to the last test. Okay. These two things will keep you from fatigue. Eat glycogen and I don't make lactate, that's going to keep me from having either central and potentially some peripheral fatigue. Okay. Now, what does actually change? It's fascinating from a biochemical standpoint. One of the largest changes that we see with aerobic training is in the mitochondria. Okay. The amount of mitochondria that you have in your muscles may double. Okay. It may double within 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that. Okay. It may double. The other thing that happens is you'll have double the mitochondria, and they will get bigger, and they will function better. Okay, and they will function. I saw some data the last week. There was a process of something called mitophagy. Has anyone heard of mitophagy? Have I heard of something called autophagy? Mitophagy is all of you have some mitochondria in some of your cells that are kind of busted. Right? They're there, they're hanging on, but under conditions where we exercise, we tax things, we can actually make oxygen-free radicals. And when we activate mitophagy, we basically go in and clean out and get rid of the broken mitochondria that aren't working very well. So we get basically new mitochondria that work well and they get bigger. Having more and having them be bigger means there's more surface area, okay, for the electron transport chain. More sort of inner, whatever we call this, matrix space in here for the Krebs cycle, okay? If there's more and they're larger, there's a greater chance that a pyruvate molecule can get into it, or that a lactate molecule can get into it. So we're making our chances by doing all of this of having sort of our substrates and enzymes that we need to run aerobic metabolism in close proximity to each other. Okay? This happens in all fiber types. It especially happens in type 2A fibers. Okay? Most of you have a reasonable amount of type 1 fibers, and especially the slowest, smallest ones you use all the time, they already have a bunch of mitochondria. Okay? But when we train, we shift from 2X to 2A, and we dramatically ramp up mitochondria to 2X. Which makes them much, much better at doing aerobic metabolism. So here's some data. I love data. Makes me very happy. It's old data. And this was published in 1967. This is one of the first instances ever of people seeing this near doubling of mitochondria with exercise training. This is from the guy who is referred to as the father of exercise biochemistry. His name is John Halazzi. He was at Washington University in St. Louis, but they took rats. They trained them for 12 weeks. They ran 5 days per week for 10 to 30-minute bouts and progressively increased the speed and the bout length. You don't want to know how you motivate a rat to run on a treadmill. Put a thing that shocks them if they won't run on the back of the treadmill. It makes them go. Not great. What you can see here is sedentary exercise. They pull out the gastroc, they pull out the soleus, right? You're going to look at sort of, this is the sort of microliters of oxygen per minute per gram of muscle weight. Basically, that cytochrome oxidase was using and succinate oxidase is using. So these are going to be some enzymes doing things. That goes way up. But the other big thing here is we go from about 3 milligrams per gram of muscle of mitochondrial protein to about 4.5. Okay. So this is one of the very, very first instances of us ever noticing that the amount of mitochondrial protein, because they take the muscle out and they grind them up, and then they try to pull out with chromatography all the stuff that's in the mitochondria, that it goes way, way up. Okay. This has since been repeated many, many, many hundreds of times. Okay. So that kind of raises the question, how do you form new mitochondria? What's the signal? How do we take the ones you have and make them want to proliferate? What is it about exercise that's going to stimulate? I think I've mentioned this before, and you guys should have learned this in human phys. Mitochondria have their own DNA. It's separate from the other DNA in your body. Okay? We think mitochondria were sort of symbiotic. They were one single cell organisms that had a symbiotic relationship with sort of whatever early cells or things. That's evolutionary biology. We don't want to go down that road with all of that. But they have their own DNA. Your mitochondrial DNA came from your mom. Okay? Past maternal. So it's an X-linked chromosome type of thing. So there is a thing in your cells called peroxisome proliferator activated receptor gamma coactivator. What the hell is that, Dr. Black? We simply call it PGC1 alpha. Okay? PGC1 alpha is the mitochondrial biogenesis, making mitochondria equivalent. This is the gene hub. When we activate PGC1 alpha, that's the primary thing that's going to drive us. So here are pre and post training, the percentage activation of PGC1 alpha in a group of these with diabetic folks, right? It's gone up almost 3 times here. PGC1 alpha protein content. Here we look at it by fiber type. And you will note that it goes up in the ones, but it really goes up in type 2 fibers, 2A fibers. Okay. All I want you guys to know, right, is that a lot of the biogenesis seems to stem from the activate PGC1 alpha. Exercise, and that drives things. Okay. This is more of the signaling pathway. Again, you don't have to know hardly any of these things. But one of the things that we think is going on is that it activates PGC1 alpha is energy deprivation or energy use during exercise. So that's why total work may matter. You use more energy, you activate a thing called AMP kinase, which then can activate PGC1 alpha. Okay. And then we've got these other things when you exercise, calcium goes up. It acts on this thing called Krebs. Krebs normally inhibits PGC1 alpha, but when calcium binds to it, it actually blocks that. So if you block the thing that blocks, you get activation. So it's kind of a sort of complicated signaling thing, and all of these kind of things. All I want you to know is basically when PGC1 alpha gets activated, that's a good chance that we're going to tell that cell to make new mitochondria. Okay, all that I need you to know. Okay. So why is it good to have more mitochondria? This is biochemistry. Okay, this is biochemistry. Remember, what causes fatigue? Somebody give me something. What causes fatigue? Hydrogen. Okay. What else causes fatigue? Pardon? We're going to take the hydrogen off the lactic acid, and we're going to say the hydrogen is what causes fatigue. Lactate's fine. It's not going to bother us too much. Using glycogen, good. What else? Using glucose, excellent. Okay. Depleting blood glucose, depleting glycogen, making lactic acid are big things that cause fatigue. Okay. So if I want to limit fatigue, I need to limit all of those things if possible. Okay. That was the answer to the fat question on the test. Why is using fat good? Because you don't use glucose and glycogen, so it prevents central fatigue. You don't make lactic acids. You don't have peripheral. Okay. But mitochondria do all of those things. By having more mitochondria, I increase the sensitivity of the metabolic system from a biochemical standpoint. Okay. Increasing sensitivity means that for any concentration of pyruvate or free fatty acid or something that goes in, I get the reaction will take place more often. Okay. So I've got more enzymes, there's a greater chance for reactions to take place. So it will increase the amount of pyruvate and fat that can enter into the Krebs cycle. Okay. Therefore, we make more energy aerobically from either glucose or from fat. We can't use fat, right, in the anaerobic. So we make less lactic acid. And by ramping up fat use, because when there's more enzymes, there's a greater chance it will encounter fat. We get more energy from fat. We use fat. We use less glycogen and less blood glucose. Therefore, there's less of a chance. And one of the best adaptations, and one of the other reasons, right, why everybody should go run today and tomorrow and the day after is when you become aerobically trained, you metabolize fat better. Okay? Which I just see Chick-fil-A milkshakes floating by in my head when I say that. Strawberry milkshake, strawberry milkshake. Better at metabolism. I can better metabolize fat if I'm more aerobically trained. Okay. So I'm going to put this here, and we can argue about whether or not it's a muscle adaptation or if it's actually a cardiovascular adaptation. It doesn't really matter, okay? But we get more capillaries as well. You get more mitochondria, we also get more capillaries, okay? The other big thing that happens, though, is you get what we call capillary density. So I've got one muscle fiber, and beforehand, maybe I had like 4 capillaries that went around that fiber, okay? The density of capillaries is basically how much capillary area is there per muscle fiber area. So what happens after training is here I got the same fiber, now I got a whole lot more capillaries running by it, okay? So rather than counting numbers, I've increased the density capillaries there. This allows more blood flow to and from muscle. It also slows down blood flow, which gives us more time, oxygen to diffuse, the free fatty acids to diffuse glucose, to diffuse hormones, etc. It also limits diffusion distance. Okay. All of these reactions take place by simple random chains. Simple random chains. And so to increase that random chance, I need to put things in close proximity to each other. Have that chance go up. So having more capillaries can do that. It also helps me get rid of lactic acid and buffer and do some shuttling. Big thing is that diffusion distance goes down and it slows down flow. So I get more oxygen and more substrate in, get more CO2 out. Okay. Metabolically, we also make your lactate threshold. So remember, a lactate threshold is an exercise. The intensity at which you begin to increase lactate in the blood over normal resting levels. So it may occur in an untrained person at, say, 50% of VO2 max. That's the intensity when we're going to start making lactate above. We've done something. That one. Training, maybe it's now at 60% of your VO2 or 80% of it. We tested a girl that was on our cross-country team in my very first job. Her lactate threshold was at 93% of her VO2 max. He can basically race at her VO2 max. Okay. Of all of the girls on our cross-country team, she had the lowest VO2 max, and yet she was the best runner. She had maxed out how good she was ever going to be able to be at that. Okay? Because her lactate threshold was so high. Once you get over lactate threshold, you begin to get hydrogen ion accumulation, and then there's going to be relatively soon another threshold level. If Dr. Mike was teaching this, we talk about lactate threshold 1 and lactate threshold 2 and some things. We don't have time to get into all the weeds of this, but it's just that it goes up. Okay? The consequence of this is you can run faster, or you can row at a higher power output, or you can climb up a hill that is steeper than you could beforehand without making lactic acid. Because more of that pyruvate can get shunted over into the mitochondria. And that's going to be good. So, a lot of this change comes from decreased production because of more mitochondria and more capillaries. But you're also going to get some increased removal. You can shuttle the lactate from one to the other, get it out of the blood a little bit faster. Anybody cares about these things? In August, knock on wood, we are supposed to be, Dr. Larson and I testing, Anna may or may not know that you're supposed to be testing all of the endurance, the distance athletes on the track to learn their VO2 max and their lactate thresholds and these things to help them prescribe their training. So this is really important to kind of see where these things. Okay. So if you find somebody that's got a big VO2 max and a lactate threshold that's relatively kind of moderate in like the 60 to 70% range, then you can train them, get their threshold up, and actually increase their functional performance to a fairly great extent without ever beating their VO2. One of the things we like to focus on from an applied standpoint. Okay, we talked about fiber type conversion. Okay. I mentioned this one as well. Right, I talked about that we derive a greater amount of energy. So metabolically, at rest and during exercise, fat, that is good. Fat goes into those mitochondria. Remember, when you do oxidize fat, it makes 3 times as much energy as you make when you break down glucose. And so that's going to be good. We can then spare glycogen and spare blood glucose, increase exercise time. So increasing fat use really helps us from a long distance perspective. Okay. And then exercise at any given intensity or speed or work rate. VO2 doesn't change very much as long as your weight doesn't change. Okay. I can take Destiny, we could make her more fit, we can make her VO2 max go up, say 25%. We have her go run today and whatever she weighs and costs her X amount of oxygen consumption to go 6 miles an hour. We train her for 12 weeks, her VO2 goes up 25%. We have her run 6 miles an hour again. Her VO2 while she's running at that is going to be basically the same, but she weighs this. We've increased the top end so she can actually go faster, right? It's going to feel easier than before she was training. We can kind of increase the top end. Okay. So VO2 doesn't change, but if you look at somebody's RER, it's likely going to be a little bit lower because we're using more fat, and we're going to get less fatigue because of those things. So some really fascinating kind of adaptations that take place here. Okay. Talked about those two. Okay. So why do these changes from a metabolic perspective lead to increased performance? Okay. Well, with long duration exercise, you get decrease in fatigue, primarily central fatigue, because you spare glycogen because you're using fat. Okay. That's one of the big issues. You also will make less lactic acid at an even work rate, so you're going to limit some level of discomfort and peripheral fatigue as well. But a lot of it during long duration is because of this glycogen sparing effect. During short duration exercise, you may actually increase your ability to buffer hydrogen ions, and you're going to make a few at those things. And you seem to be able to better tolerate pain. There does seem to be some training adaptations that are going to occur from that perspective. Right? Okay, let's take 5 minutes or so here. We'll pause and then we'll come back and we'll talk about cardiovascular adaptations. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about some other things. All right, let's talk about, are there ventilatory or pulmonary system adaptations to exercise? And so from an anatomical standpoint, the answer is mostly no. Your lungs don't get bigger, don't get more alveoli, don't necessarily get more alveolar capillaries to increase diffusion capacity or anything like that. You may get a little bit of training effect in the diaphragm or in your intercostal muscles, but not very much. Okay, not very much. Most of you are not ever going to be limited in your exercise. Your VO2 max is not limited by your pulmonary system. Okay, for most of you. What I'm showing you here is if we look at a trained person versus an untrained person, or you untrained versus you trained, what is your ventilation going to look like between those two things? So at rest, whether you're more or less trained, your ventilation is basically the same. Not going to look any different. Okay? During submaximal exercise, if it's below the ventilatory threshold, so if you're below lactate threshold, there's basically no change. You go for a walk, your ventilation is basically the same. As long as your weight is the same, your VO2 is the same, your ventilation is the same, not a big problem. Above T-vent, so above ventilatory threshold, above lactate threshold, until we get to VO2 max, you are generally going to have a slightly lower ventilatory response than if you're trained and if you are untrained at the same work rate. Okay? At the same work rate. This is primarily due to decreased lactic acid production. Okay? At ventilatory thresholds, you get over lactate threshold, you start making lactic acid, hydrogen gets into your blood, it gets buffered by bicarbonate, which is how we're storing CO2 in the blood in one way. That makes extra carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide that has not come from the electron transport chain. Remember, CO2 is the primary driver of breathing. So you have metabolic CO2 from anaerobic metabolism plus CO2 that's been buffered from lactic acid. So there's more CO2, so you breathe. So when you make lactate threshold go up, we can limit a little bit of that buffering and we can keep breathing over. At maximal exercise, at VO2 max, if your VO2 max goes up, your max ventilation is going to go up. Okay? It's generally going to go up. And that tells us immediately that the ventilation is not a limiting. It's not a limiting factor. In clinical pulmonary patients, this may be very rare. Although, to be honest, one of the problems with the lungs is why lung cancer is so bad, it's why COPD and emphysema are so bad, is lung tissue does not regenerate. Okay? Because it will not regenerate, something's broken and it goes wrong and there's pathologies, just kind of screwed. So we don't see a lot in there, but these are some things that you may see a little bit. Okay. Okay, let's talk about cardiovascular side. Lots of adaptations here. And you get more mitochondria, and then we get a bunch of changes in the cardiovascular. The vast majority of the cardiovascular adaptations do two things. Two things. One, they make stroke volume bigger. And two, they allow us to get more blood to skeletons. Okay. Just partially that's what stroke volume does. Okay. The fastest thing that changes from a cardiovascular system perspective, the first thing that changes is your blood volume. Run today, bigger blood volume, probably by Thursday. Okay, probably by Thursday. Plasma volume goes up initially, so the water is going to go up initially. That will then be followed, it kind of lags, but it will then be followed by an increase in red blood cells. Okay? You have 5 liters of blood in your body at a 40% hematocrit level right now. Run for a couple of weeks, you may have 5 1/3 liters of blood, but it will, in the early stage, you will not be 40% hematocrit anymore, you might be 37. Yet plasma expands first, and then there's going to be a lag as we ramp up from the bone marrow and we produce red blood cells to get us back to kind of whatever that regular, if it was 40, it will dip and then it will come back. Mechanistically, I call this, I don't know where I first heard this, I call it a persistent acute effect. Okay? Here's why we talked about these hormones. You go run, especially if it's hot and you sweat some, antidiuretic hormone goes up, aldosterone goes up. We then overcompensate after exercise by drinking more water. And because of ADH and aldosterone, we lose less water. We retain water and sodium at the kidneys, so we hold on to water. And then that leads to an expansion of plasma. Adaptation goes away very quickly within a few days. Run today, it'll go up for a couple of days, and if you don't run again, it goes back down. Run today, take tomorrow off, run Thursday, take Friday off, run Saturday. We've now stacked 3 of these on top of each other. By next week, even greater expansion. And it stays as long as you are in that sort of, you're consistently exercising in that 48 to 72 hour. Okay? That's why I could call it a persistent acute effect. It persists as long as you continue exercising, but it's acute because it happens after one bout and only lasts for. Okay. That's how this goes up. So blood volume goes up. Remember from yesterday, we talked about regulation of stroke volume, regulation of cardiac output. When you have a larger blood volume, it makes preload go up. Preload goes up, stroke volume. If stroke volume goes up, cardiac output goes up. I promise you, if cardiac output goes up, it's matched. Okay. So that's one of the ways that having more blood in this way is going to be good. Here's some data just illustrating what I was showing you guys. Here's days of physical activity. They went out to almost a month and a half. I'm sorry, almost 3 months, almost to 90 days. What you see is this top piece here. This is plasma volume. And then here is blood volume. And then here are red cells that are going on all of this. And so you get this big plasma volume expansion in the first couple of weeks. Then it takes about 3 weeks, and then red cells will catch up. And then it will hold there. Most people can increase their blood volume maybe 15 to 20%. Some people can get to 25 or 30. A lot of it depends upon where you are. Okay. But there's a level of expansion that we're going to get there. This is just showing, I love this graph because I'm going to show you lots of things from a cardiovascular perspective that correlate VO2 max. They tested, 50 or 60 people. Here is their blood volume per kilogram of body weight and their VO2 max. And you will see that as blood volume per body weight goes up, so does VO2 max. All right. Bigger blood volume makes VO2 max. Mostly because it makes stroke volume go up, which makes cardiac output. That's the big thing. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about arterial venous oxygen difference. One of the other parts of the equation. Remember, AVO2 difference is estimate or a way to try to measure oxygen extraction out of capillaries blood. Rest, there's basically no change. AVO2 difference. Okay. AVO2 difference is going to correspond to work rate. Yeah, as long as your body weight doesn't change, it costs you the same amount of oxygen to walk or run, whether you're trained or not, as before. Right? And so very little changes at rest and during submaximal exercise. Even though we have a lot more mitochondria, we don't actually need to use any more oxygen because it requires the same ATP to do the same work. Okay? At maximal exercise, AVO2 difference will go way up. Okay? It will go up and correspond to your mitochondria and your capillaries. What happens is during maximal exercises, the muscle can extract more oxygen from the blood because it has more mitochondria and it has more capillaries. So it can get the blood there in close proximity and it's got the mitochondria to use the oxygen so it will pull it out. Okay. Blood pressure is weird. Do I have anybody that's hypertensive? Anybody hypertensive in class? Just drop. Okay. Rock, do you mind me asking how hypertensive you are? Oh, wow. Okay. So, like for real. Okay. We could exercise and make rocks, or probably as much as rock exercises, your blood pressure would be higher if you didn't exercise. So, if you have a person that's hypertensive, we can knock with exercise, we can knock the blood pressure down maybe 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury, especially systolic pressure. In the rest of you guys that are relatively normal, no changes. Very little change on. And so there's not a lot that's going to go on, but we do see in people that chronically exercise over their life, it does oftentimes take them longer to develop hypertension. In people that are like 65 or 70 years older, about 2/3 or 3/4 of them are hypertensive. So if you can stay active and keep your aerobic exercise up, you may be able to stave off your hypertension a little bit longer. From health and fitness, you guys should remember, right? Hypertension is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, for kidney disorders, basically everything. Sorry, Brown. On those kinds of things. Okay. Okay. I just love these graphs. Sorry, I have my grad students will tell you that I adore well done graphs and visually displaying data in a way that is easy to digest and kind of make it. So one of the other things that you guys could have asked each other about when we were lining everybody up on who's the most fit, you would have no way of knowing this, okay? But we could have asked who has, per the size of their leg, who has the biggest femoral artery? Okay? Who's the biggest femoral artery? And so when I was a grad student, when I was a master's student, we measured with Doppler ultrasound. Okay? We would measure blood flow and vessel size, or artery size in the femoral artery. One of the things that you would consistently notice is that people that were untrained had smaller femoral arteries than people that were well aerobically trained. I mean, you're getting these highly aerobically trained people, and they just like have these like giant freaking femoral arteries, like these giant pipes in their legs, and their blood would move really slow because of all of that. It was low pressure, it was great. Okay, that's borne out in this data. And the reason why better training, you have larger things, is a thing called arteriogenesis. Arteriogenesis. Okay, increasing the size of arteries, both conduit and resistance. This is a form of what we call vascular remodel. Okay? Your blood vessels are very much like your muscle. They're always in a state of flux. They're always remodeling. So if you shoot and force a bunch of blood through them, often they expand. Okay? Try to slow the blood flow down, lower the pressure. What's going on? So one of the things that's the single best way to make these things bigger, the lumen size or the diameter inside the vessel go up, and to decrease wall thickness, which is really good, okay, is to exercise. So here are people, right? This is change in femoral artery diameter from like a baseline kind of regular person. And so what you can see here is this is data taken from individual studies that have looked at the effects of sort of endurance training, endurance athletes, and then all of these models of what we would call inactivity or unloading. So here are folks with spinal cord injuries. They have about a 30% reduction in femoral artery size, right? 3 weeks in acute SCI, 3 weeks of not moving and they're 25% down. 4 weeks of bed rest, people are at like 15% down. Casting a leg for a couple of weeks, you're at almost 10%. 8 weeks of training, up about 5, 12 weeks, up almost 10%. And then endurance athletes are like 20% over everybody. This is lumen size. This is wall thickness. Wall thickness is a predictor of blood clot risk, predictor of atherosclerosis, things like that. So this is the inverse here compared to this. Okay. So when you exercise and you run a bunch, bike a bunch, get bigger arteries. Makes it easier for us to put blood. Makes it easier for us to get blood out to skeletal muscle. Okay. So that's one of the really powerful things. Well, how does that happen? I don't know. Okay. It's a complicated signaling process. We have quite a bit of an idea on all of these things, but a lot of it comes down to shear stress. We talked about shear stress yesterday. When blood velocity increases during exercise, right? Blood flows through the arteries faster and faster. It creates shear on the endothelium. That shear, body doesn't like. So it says vasodilator. So one of the other things that it does is that happens a bunch, and it says, okay, remodel the arteries so the arteries wider, which will slow the blood flow down. So shear matters, and then stretch. Okay, exercise makes blood pressure go up. Systolic pressure goes up. If you watch an artery while a person is exercising, okay, you can see it do things like this. It will jump every time the heart beats. It expands and then it comes back. Expands and so that's because of these cyclic changes in left ventricular contraction force that make blood pressure go up and force more blood through, so it expands. Okay, that stretch in combination with the shear activates a bunch of pathways. Okay, that are driven through a thing called eNOS, which stands for endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which you don't have to know, and a thing called, I just love it's called VEGF, called vascular endothelial growth factor. That's going to get turned on, but it activates some signals and it causes the vessel to remodel. And this can take, you can see changes within a month to 6 weeks or thereabouts. You don't have to know any of the signals that are on here. You don't have to know the signaling pathway. I just want to give you guys kind of an idea of there's a bunch of intracellular signals that are going on. So we already talked about this once, but we'll put it here again and kind of emphasize it, that's arteriogenesis. There's also a thing called angiogenesis. Angiogenesis is making new blood. Arterio is the ones you already have, make bigger. Angio is take these, give me twice as many. So increasing capillary density, that's going to be angiogenesis. You also sprout in your coronary arteries when you exercise a bunch. You sprout new coronary arteries, so you can supply more blood more easily to the heart, which is going to be really, really good. We've kind of already talked about what's going on here. I just wanted to put it in here again, because I know I put it under the muscle metabolic ones. You can also list it potentially as a cardiovascular mutation. Okay. There's some really old data. They were published in a review article in 2011. These were from the 1970s, but it's capillary to fiber ratio. So it's this measure of capillary density. It's graphed against VO2 max. And so you've got some kind of average-ish people down here. Studies that have those things that are going to be here, up to a person with a VO2 of almost 80. So very, very fit. You see this kind of nice linear-ish relationship that as VO2 max goes up, capillary to fiber ratio is going to go up. So more capillaries is going to be associated with a higher VO2. This is likely going to alter VO2 max by reducing our diffusion distance and by increasing AVO2. More oxygen out of the blood into our muscles. Okay, let's do heart rate and stroke volume. You guys asked about, so we should ask each other about our heart rates. That was good. Heart rate falls. As you become more trained, your resting heart rate goes down, and then therefore your heart rate at any given work rate during the time. So pre-training, you're at 150 beats per minute to run 6 miles an hour. After training, turn up. Why does this happen? We get an increase in parasympathetic input to the SA node, which lowers the firing rate of the heart. Also, stroke volume is going to go up, and so I can get the same cardiac output. I don't have to have it frequently. Good part of this is we use less energy to pump a given amount of blood, so your heart becomes more efficient. Stroke volume goes up with training as well. It probably changes more than your heart rate does. So there are a couple of things that drive the increase in stroke. One of the primary ones is increase in left ventricular size. You get left ventricular cardiac hypertrophy, which I'll show you guys a little bit about. Your left ventricle gets bigger, so there's more space to put more blood in, and because it's bigger, it can contract more forcefully. That makes stroke volume go. Okay. We also get increased filling time and venous return from reduced heart rate. We also get increased venous return because we have an increased plasma. All of these things are going to work together. But having more plasma volume doesn't help us a huge amount until we get a bigger left ventricle. So there's two kinds of cardiac hypertrophy. You guys heard of this? There's something called concentric hypertrophy and eccentric hypertrophy. Okay. One of them is good, one of them is not so good. Okay. Arguably, more reasons why maybe my weightlifters should think about going for a run. It's going to be here. So this is going to originate from something called pressure overload versus volume overload. So let me walk you through that. Okay. Here's a normal, right? A normal cardiac muscle fiber. Okay. Here. If we give it a stimulus like aerobic exercise, when I exercise at very high rates, it has to contract forcefully. I've got lots of muscle pump. I've got lots of venous return. I'm really maxing out freely. Okay. That is going to, in turn, stretch the left ventricle every time the blood comes. Stretch, contract, stretch, contract. Okay. We call that eccentric overload because as it stretches, that's an eccentric load on the left ventricle. What tends to happen when you put that kind of a stimulus on cardiac muscle is that you're going to get basically a larger lumen space, larger kind of open area in the left ventricle with somewhat the same or somewhat thinner walls. Okay, so we call that eccentric hypertrophy or volume overload hypertrophy. We see this with aerobic training. Okay, that gets us a bigger stroke volume. That's good cardiac hypertrophy. The opposite can happen when you have high blood pressure. Okay, And the reason that I only halfway joke about resistance training is people that resistance train a lot do a lot of Valsalva. Do a lot of Valsalva, you have really, really high blood pressure. So you're exposing the heart to these very, very high blood pressure. It most commonly happens in people that have chronic high blood pressure. Sorry, Rob. On all of this, right? Strength training, hypertension, and these things. What happens with this is like traditional skeletal muscle hypertrophy. It has to contract harder to overcome that high aortic pressure. And so what you get then is you get a thicker wall. The heart gets bigger, but the muscle itself is what's hypertrophy, much less so the space inside the left ventricle. And so this type of hypertrophy is more associated with cardiovascular disease. So just need to be careful about that. That's volume overload versus pressure. All right. So what about cardiac output? Well, we've already said that max heart rate doesn't really change, but max stroke volume goes up and max AVO2 difference can go up. Then obviously max cardiac output can go up. Stroke volume. So when you plug it all in thick, VO2 goes up because stroke volume goes up, and AVO2 difference goes up. Capillaries and mitochondria, and voila, there we get the whole. That's what's going to happen. I think I have a cardiac output slide. No, did I not put it in here? Nope, I didn't. Okay. My apologies. I had another slide where they graph cardiac output against VO2 max. And basically, it's what you think. People that have the biggest cardiac output for their body size. So that's kind of what all is going to happen. So my last slide, what changes? How quickly does it change? We can see VO2 changes relatively quickly within a couple of days because of blood volume expansion. Blood volume. Mitochondria takes several weeks because it's got to alter protein synthesis rates. Weirdly, I don't think I put anywhere how much your VO2 max can go up. It's usually about 10 to about 40% in most people. Right? So if you're a person that's 30 mLs per kg per minute, it's very reasonable that you ought to be able to get to 40 or something like that. It's not an uncommon kind of thing. Okay. So we do these things. Oh, that's what I got. Okay. Questions? You got time. Not going to start anything new. Anything? Y'all got nothing? Any other test-related things that I need to be aware of? Other than make the questions easier? No? Okay. Then I shall see you guys tomorrow. Please make sure if you haven't turned in your assignment, the stuff from last week, you should get those to me. You can turn them in here or you can email them to me.
I need to know.
Not done, I can go finish. I can find your. I don't think Carlos is done. That's what I'm gonna go do anyways. Great. Okay.
No, wait. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so.
I put it in, there was like a folder on your office door that said like, I need for.
Somebody came about it, there is in the stack.
So I just put it in there. I think it's classified documents or something. It was like. I was-
We do our regular classes. What do we do in class, what do we not do in class, what do we change, and I give people like how it's going to fill it out, and I put that on my board, so they. You only want to have their name on them, so turn it in and check their name off. They want to be like, I hate you, it's just terrible. But that sometimes.
I put it in there,
Okay.
cause I came in here, but everyone was gone, so.
Because I had another one, somebody made the test up the day after because they were sick, and it was in a manila envelope, so I could not only get, that's insane.
Yeah, it was-
Mailbox.
Okay,
So, I was like, oh, well, it's just that one, but where's that girl's?
but do you have it? Okay.
So we're good, no worries, no worries, we got it, we're okay.
All right.
You're okay. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.
Yes.
Say if we wait, that's great.
Yeah. Yours may be done. Trying to remember, but yours may be done.
It's bad, I don't want you to see it, like, well, I know you see it anyway, but like.